Open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 19. There was an older woman who loved to help people in the church, and she heard about a young family where the husband was going to be away for the week, and the young mom just had her hands full. She had 3 children at home, all under the age of 6. And sure enough, she wasn't feeling well, and she was having all kinds of stress. And so this older woman called her and asked her how she is doing. And she said, "Oh, I have a splitting headache, and my back is killing me, and the house is a disaster area. The kids almost have no more clean clothes. I'm sure I'm not fixing them healthy meals." And the little old woman said, "Don't give it another thought. I'm going to come over to your house. I'm going to clean your house. I am going to do all of your laundry. I'm going to fix the children their meals, and I'm even going to fix some extra that you can thaw out later in the week to have for them, and I'm just going to take care of you in any way I can. By the way, when will Sam be home?" And the young woman said, "Who's Sam?" And the older woman said, "Well, your husband, Sam." And she said, "Well, my husband's not named Sam." And the older woman thought, "Oh, no, I've called the wrong number. I'm so sorry to have bothered you." And there's this long pause, and then this little voice that said, "Well, does that mean you're not coming over?" Now, as I said before, I am trying to talk about mental health and why the church needs to care. I'm calling this, "How Do You Feel?" And this morning I want us to consider Christians who feel overwhelmed by stress and burnout. There are a lot of congregations who've done mental health studies of the members of their congregation. And as I was getting ready for this, I began looking at those studies. It's amazing to me how consistent their findings are. For example, the most mentioned mental health challenge Christians say they face is anxiety, 69%. The second is depression, 60%. And the third most challenging mental health issue among Christians is burnout and stress at 55%. But when you look down into the data, there is one age group above all other age groups that have an issue with stress. This age group is from 30 to 45, and it is predominantly women. And they say that the number one mental health challenge they face is burnout and stress by 82%. Now, why would that be? I think that's because that is the time when usually children are growing up in a home and careers are being established. Every week, young moms and dads try to keep their kids fed and clothed to school on time while keeping doctor's appointments and making soccer practice and piano lessons and making sure they do their homework and their household chores. And somewhere in there they have to bring in enough income to fund all of that. Kids are so different. They're so different in personality. They're so different in their emotional structure. Carmen and I, our first child, this adorable baby girl, she was so calm and peaceful. She began sleeping the night through within the first month of her birth. And Carmen and I thought, hey, not much to this child rearing thing. So we decided to have another within 2 years. And he did not sleep an entire night through until he was somewhere in the middle of his twos. Can you imagine that? I have such a wonderful wife. She took pity on me on many occasions because I had to teach an 8 o'clock class at the university. She got up, I admit, a lot more than what I did. I got up a few times and she found me in the living room asleep with the baby kind of hanging in my arms. She didn't much care for that. But nevertheless, keeping that child during the night was exhausting. Exhausting. And so young parents would come up to us and they're all worn out and tired and frazzled about these babies that they have at home. And they said, "Is this the way it is?" And Carmen and I would look at each other and look at them and say, "Yep, that's about it." It is hard to parent children. And I don't know if we say that often enough in the church, but it is. And I don't want to scare anybody. But when you look at the most common causes of child abuse in our country, most of the time it comes at the hands of the child's own parents, where a child is taken and it's shaken so much that damage is caused, and some other kinds of child abuse occurs. And number one reason given for that, the baby wouldn't stop crying. Now, some of us who are older have probably forgotten about those days, but they're very, very real. And stress is very, very real for not just young parents, but I think parents in general who have children at home. Now, that's not all. There's a larger group of people that kind of cuts against all age groups, and these are known as the people helpers. People who view themselves as people helpers, they tend to have higher levels of stress, even among Christians. These are the doctors and the nurses and the dentists. These are the first responders, law enforcement. These are people like teachers and parents and counselors and pastors and even preachers. People who are trying to help others. They believe that is what they are for. And while that is a good thing, it can also exact a price. I want to tell you a weird fact this morning, and it's going to be kind of a reoccurring theme through this series of messages. Most Christians would rather help somebody else than get help themselves. And that is a major problem when it comes to maintaining one's mental health. Even among preachers, I was looking at some data not too long ago. In the last 8 years, the average dropout rate among preachers who get burned out and they say, "I can't, that's all, I don't need any more," that number used to run around 14%. Do you realize in the last 8 years, that number has grown to nearly 40%? I mean, there are more preachers quitting than what our Bible colleges and preacher schools will ever be able to turn out. If this trend continues, there's going to be more and more congregations that can't find a full-time preacher. Particularly churches like in this area of the country where there are so many smaller kinds of congregations. Most of them will have pulpits that will simply be filled by volunteers. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except it takes a little toll on your consistency. But that's part of the mental health challenge of being a minister of the Word. But I'm not unique. We all have our mental health challenges. And because we care so much about blessing others, that can actually add to the challenge. I know of a number of people here who are stressed out. And yet, at the same time, I can't tell you how hard it is to talk them into getting some assistance. And this is not news to any of them. But this is something that you just run into in churches all the time. It's like if people had enough faith, they wouldn't have these mental challenges. Man, is that a misnomer? It's not about the amount of faith, it's the amount of honesty that you're willing to have about yourself. And so this morning, I want us to look at God's stressed out, burned out prophet named Elijah. And before I read this passage from 1 Kings 19, I want you to have a little bit of the backstory. We first hear about Elijah in 1 Kings 17, and there's a new king that has just come to power. He is an evil king. His name is Ahab. And what he does is he introduces the worship to the idol Baal. He builds a giant altar. And this is mainly due to the influence of his wife. You've probably heard of her. Her name was Jezebel. It's amazing how you never hear of parents naming their daughters Jezebel. And that was kind of, she was just an evil woman. And even when the king thought about changing his mind, his wife Jezebel said, "No, you're not changing." And he said, "No, I'm not changing." But what happens when Elijah comes on the scene is God announces through him, because of this disobedience, a great drought is going to be brought on the land. And that drought lasts for a long time. Now, eventually here in 1 Kings 18, Elijah and Ahab finally meet up. Jezebel's been having the prophets of God killed. A guy named Obadiah, a godly man, has been trying to stash away and hide prophets at various places, even in caves, so that they would not be harmed. Elijah says, let's just go ahead and settle this issue. And so he asked the king to turn out hundreds of prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he would show up, and we'd see which God really is in charge. There were 450 prophets of Baal, and they built all these altars. They took these beeves and they cut them up on the altar, and they were going to call down fire from their God to light the meat on these altars. And they shouted and they danced and they yelled and they cut themselves, and no matter what kind of commotion they went through, no fire. Elijah, he was the kind of guy who gave him a little sass. They'd be going through their conniptions to call down fire from Baal, and Elijah'd be over there throwing shade. Maybe he's busy. Maybe your God's traveling. Maybe he's otherwise preoccupied. The NIV is very kind in how it translates that. The Hebrew word actually means maybe he's going to the bathroom. Here's Elijah. He's really laying it on thick. And then it's his turn. After all of this has gone on and there's no fire, he tells the people, I want you to take my altar here, and I want you to douse it with water. And douse it again, and build a trench around it, and really make it wet. And then he asked God to light the altar, and he did. And the people were so impressed, they rose up, and they took the prophets of Baal, and they massacred them by sword. And Elijah had to feel victorious. And so he just assumes that Ahab is going to change his ways, and Ahab goes home and says, "You won't believe what Elijah did." And Jezebel said, "It's not going to make any difference. Let's just kill him next." And so 1 Kings chapter 19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And so Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush. He sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And then he laid down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate, he drank, and then he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." And so he got up and he ate and he drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." And the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." And the Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus." And he tells him to anoint Elzel and Jehu and also Elijah. And after that, look at verse 18. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and those whose mouths have not kissed him." I want us to think about this text this morning. How does a person go from calling down fire from heaven to losing their personal fire? How can a person have the courage to speak for the great I am? How does that kind of person go to "I quit"? It's not a journey that others have not taken. I know of a lot of people, I'm sure many of you do, people who were once very active in the Lord's church, people who participated and were among the leaders of a congregation in terms of their influence and their enthusiasm, but something happened and they faded away. They lost some of their fire. A lot of times they would say, I'm just burned out and I need to take a break. But the break wasn't for a week or two or a month or two. The break is still going on. How does that come to be? I want us to consider just some things we learned about burnout from Elijah. Number one, it warns against a prolonged period of absence from a spiritual community. Elijah had served God as a loner for a long time. Even in 1 Kings 18, as he's as down as he has ever going to be, he leaves his servant in this one place and then he goes on alone. He has been alone for a long, long time. He seems to have no connection to any kind of group or faith community. And brothers and sisters, no one can stay mentally and spiritually healthy without a real connection to God's people. Secondly, consider unmet expectations. I think Elijah had dedicated his life as a prophet of God to one main cause. He was going to eradicate the worship of Baal in Israel. That never happened. He didn't even come close to that happening. His goal should have been to faithfully serve God, but he was focused on an outcome. And when you are focused on outcomes, you have more stress, because things rarely turn out the way you think they should. How does a person go from exhilaration to exhaustion? Well, Elijah was overwhelmed by what he thought he was supposed to do. Have you ever had that dream job or that dream goal, and you finally got that dream job, or you finally reached that dream goal, and it turned out it wasn't all that dreamy? Been there? Maybe you decided that you were going to have the perfect family, but instead you ended up with yours. And maybe you thought, well, you know, I can change my marital partner. I can change that person. I can change my kids. I can change my family. I can change my relatives. I can change the church. But what happens when none of those folks really want to change? Here's the point. No one gets the life they want. Instead, you get the life you have. Elijah reminds us of that. And I think also he reminds us of the importance of losing hope. Elijah says in verse 4, I've had enough. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Let me translate that for you. I don't see the point anymore, God. I don't even think my life has mattered. So, the absence of purpose and hope regularly leads to the presence of exhaustion and despair. And while you're thinking on that, I want us to notice how God revives Elijah a bit. These are the things that I really want you to focus in on and think about this morning. First of all, pace your race so you can better hear God. The first thing that God told Elijah was not to get up and pray. He didn't say, get up and listen to this sermon. He said, get up and eat, and then go back to bed again. And after a while, he woke him up again and said, get up and eat. You've got to strengthen yourself for what is to come. Just in case you're not aware of this, Those of us who participate in such things as the meal train or some sort of ministry where food is taken to people who are sick or grieving or having some sort of difficulty, that's not just about the food. It's about the encouragement for what is ahead. It is a reminder that a person is loved, that God provides. And that's one of the reasons that is so important. Elijah was physically and emotionally fried. And God blessed him physically so that he could then prepare him to hear something spiritually. And the lesson in this, to me, is that we cannot separate our physical state from our mental health. Jesus agreed with this. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus sends out the disciples. He says, I don't want you to take any money. I don't want you to take a bag. I don't even want you to take a change of shirts. I just want you to go and teach whoever you can teach and heal whoever needs to be healed. And they came back and they were all excited and they wanted to tell Jesus stories. And the very first thing that Jesus said to them in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Just not getting enough sleep can cause a Christian to make some really poor decisions. We need to care about where we are physically. We need to pay attention to that. God designed us to need fuel, to need rest. It's the Sabbath principle. God, who created people, knew that we function best when there was a regularly planned period of rest. That's what the word Sabbath means, rest. To spend time not working, to spend some downtime, thinking about your relationship with God and what He would have of you. Those things are very, very important. And we dismiss those as Christians. We sometimes have this idea that if a person can go full speed all the time, that's something to be admired. I'll tell you, when you see a person like that, that's something to be feared. A lot of times that's a person that needs help to learn how to pace themselves. How does the important become less important than the urgent? It's because we don't pace ourselves. Some of us need a fast from going so fast. We need to slow down. Pace your race. And it requires hard choices. It really does. You have to learn to say the hardest word that a Christian will ever speak. No. We need some volunteers for this and that. I can't. But you're already, you know the people who do the most around here? The people who are already doing 12 other things. Now, there are some folks that need to become more involved in this church family. We need your yes. And you'd really enjoy the participation. But we don't need the people who have said yes too often to never be able to say no. That's not a healthy thing. And so you make hard choices. Choices that have to do with the rest you need. Eating healthy. Of getting off so many screens. I had a frightening experience this last summer. I mean, we require, whenever family, grandkids, and so on, we're going to have one meal together around the table each day. And here we are, Carmen's put the last of the food on the table. I'm looking at this big oval of loved ones, about to call things to order and lead the prayer. And every single grandchild is like this, looking down at their phone. Every single parent of a grandchild is like this, looking down at a phone. And I asked them to put their phones away, and they looked at me like I was crazy. I said, for the next few minutes, we're going to just talk to each other. One of the grandchildren threw such a fit, they had to send that child to the bedroom with his phone. But this is the world we live in, and you just think, sometimes we just need to get off so many screens so we can enjoy being around people who love us and enjoying good conversation. It's amazing what a blessing that can be and how uplifting that can be. And it's becoming a lost blessing in our culture today. And that's part of the spiritual disciplines that we need to practice that will allow God to refresh us more so that we might be more receptive to His Word. I think one of the lessons of Elijah is that when you pace your race, you make space for God's whisper. And I love the literary way this is described in 1 Kings 19. Along came this mighty wind, but God wasn't in the wind. And along comes an earthquake, God wasn't in the earthquake. Here comes the fire, God wasn't in the fire. But here comes this gentle voice. What does that mean? I want to suggest to you this morning that God is not going to always outshout the world that we live in. And He's not always going to compete for our attention. We need to be people who clear just enough space out of our life to hear Him. I guarantee you, God loves us so much, He's always whispering to us. You should be able to hear those voices inside you from time to time. He's going to speak to us through our prayer life. He's going to speak to us through His Word. He's going to speak to us through the fellowship of a loving church family. If we will simply provide Him a little time and a little space to do so. I believe that God sometimes will wait until we either slow down or have to lay down because we are sick in order to really talk to us and touch us. And here's the second thing I want to mention as I think about Elijah. We need to make community a priority. Elijah was operating on two false assumptions. Number one, I am alone. And number two, if I don't do this, nobody else will. Both of those are wrong. I sometimes hear people say this. I know they have the best intentions, and I know what they're going for when they say it, but they will often tell people, you are God's hands, and if you don't use those hands for God's purpose, then it won't get done. I want you to know that's not scriptural. You see, God's will is always done. And if it's not through you, it'll be through somebody else. When people say, God's will be done, it's not a question mark. God's will be done. And if He can't use us, He'll use somebody else. But you see, there is a blessing in allowing yourself to be used by God. It's not like the entire will of God depends on what mood you're in. It's bigger than that. And that was part of what Elijah had to come to grips with. You see, God told him, you think you're the only one? I've got 7,000 other people in Israel who are just as faithful as you are. Elijah would spend the rest of his life among people. He would develop relationships with a lot of other godly prophets. He would spend a good portion of the remainder of his life mentoring a young prophet that God had told him in 1 Kings 19 he was to go and anoint, named Elisha. By the way, Elisha had a stress problem too. You can read about that in 2 Kings 6 if you want to. You talk about matching people up. God knows what he was doing. And so I want to remind you this morning that God never created anybody to be self-sufficient. I know my dad's favorite kind of movie to watch was a Western, and his favorite kind of Western star to watch was John Wayne, the Duke. He didn't need nothing from nobody. He could stand up on his own 2 feet, and he could do for himself, and he didn't need anybody to do for him. And that was what the American male was supposed to be. That is a crock. I mean, that is so far off from reality. You realize that God made us so that we would never have to be the only one who prays for us. Do you realize that God made us so that we would never have to be the only one who was mindful of our spiritual health? That kind of interdependence flies right in the face of the church, where relationships are interdependent. I may get my words mixed up, but you understand what I'm talking about. You know, like when Paul tells the church at Rome in Romans chapter 12, we're each a part of one another. It's not about independence, interdependence. And it's not just about the amount of faith you have. When Jesus cried out right before he went to the cross in Matthew 26, where he says, my soul is crushed to the point of death. You know, Peter wasn't there to say, well, Jesus, you just need more faith. Jesus sought community. If there'd ever been a person who lived on this earth who didn't need other people, Jesus would have been the one. And yet he intentionally sought out community. He wanted to be with people. He even asked them to pray for him and to help him. He even allowed somebody to carry his own cross. Now you think about that. I want to encourage us this morning to stop settling for artificial relationships. The person that says, oh, preacher, I've got 3,000 friends. No, you don't. I'm friends with half the continent of Africa because I can't say no. That's my own problem. I was looking, somebody was asking to be accepted as a friend, and I was looking at, it says 54 other friends, and I look, and I don't know a single one of them. All of these friends, they all live in Africa. I don't know a single one of them. I don't know if our paths will ever cross. But I have trouble saying no. And the research indicates that the average person, if you don't count family, has fewer than 4 close friends in our country today. And millennials, ages 23 through 38, 22% of them report they don't have a single close friend. I wish I could explain to you how many times I have talked to people in some sort of crisis in this congregation, and I ask them, who is your closest friend in this church family? And they respond, no one. No one. A post will never replace the presence of a person. It seems to me that one of the lessons is we were never meant to be the only person that takes care of you. And so this is the last thing I want to say. We cannot be too proud to seek assistance. We cannot be too proud to seek assistance. Now, everybody who's experiencing stress, everyone who's experiencing burnout, it doesn't mean you necessarily need professional help. Sometimes you just need a loving conversation. Sometimes, if you were a part of a life group, and here's a group of Christians, they're sitting in somebody's living room, and you say, I'm really feeling down about this and that, and I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed. Don't you know that just having said that out loud and the ensuing conversation that would result in that, don't you know you'd be blessed by that? Don't you know you'd feel so much better just having said something to somebody about it? I think one of the key lessons of Elijah is that stress is not a lack of faith. A lot of times it's just a matter of letting people in. And if there's one thing that this congregation needs to focus upon when it comes to being a healthier church, is to let more people in. Now, I know there's risk in that. And trust me, I know what it's like to be burned by people who have promised to keep a confidence and then they didn't. But that's not the way most Christians are. And we need those kind of relationships. Hear this. Please, hear this. Built into most mental challenges is some sort of little gizmo that keeps us from asking for help. I think it is something that comes from the evil one. It's easy for me to look around and get to know people and say, that person needs help, that person needs help, that person needs help. The person that's the hardest for me to realize needs help, this guy. But the same thing's true for you. And so often the people who have got themselves most tied into a knot, people who genuinely need significant encouragement and mental health maintenance as a part of their struggle, they just can't ask. They just can't ask. And so I want you to know this morning, I am a recovering controlaholic. I can tell you the greatest source of my frustration and exhaustion is people. You people won't let me fix you. I can see so clearly what you people need to do. And I just don't understand why the people I love won't let me fix them. But it turns out that was never my role. I cannot control outcomes. I cannot get everybody to live like I would have them live. All I can do is have some control over inputs. And to get up each day and to say, I'm just going to try the very best of my capacity to love God and love people and hope that God can use that for good. I believe that David struggled with stress. I think he struggled with guilt. I think he struggled with depression. But I find it interesting that toward the latter part of his life, he writes in Psalm 103 about God, He rules over everything. And I'm just wondering this morning if you believe that. God rules over everything. The people we love and the people that are a challenge to love. The people who are so obviously headed down the wrong path, and the people who encourage us. The people who just desperately need help, but they cannot see it and they won't get it. And those that in some small way we can encourage and minister to. God rules over everything. Even the stuff that looks ugly and evil, God has a plan for that too. He just asks that we'll trust Him, that we'll be faithful. God rules over everything. And I hope with all my heart, that includes you. That includes